Hello and welcome everyone. We'll just wait a few moments as folks start to log in. Hello again, everyone. Before we get started in just a few minutes, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping details for our virtual format today. We just ask that everyone keep their cameras turned off and please remain muted to reduce background noise. We do have some visuals today, so we recommend that you select Speaker View in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom page in order to best see the presentations. Today's session will end with a Q&A. We ask that if you do have any questions for our panelists, that you type and send them through the chat function at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen. If required, you can also send questions to info@enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. Again, that's info@enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. Finally, today's session will be recorded. The video will be posted on our website at www.enochturnerschoolhouse.ca in 24 hours and can be shared and viewed again from there. With that, I will pass things over to the president and chair of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation, Lynn Carrillo.
Thank you, Mariah, and a warm welcome to the final session of Opening the Schoolhouse to All. The Foundation's mission is to share the story of the struggle for equal access to public education. This series explores how access to public education has been expanded and the barriers that remain. This evening, despite what that first slide said, our session is entitled, Does Liberal Education Matter in the 21st Century? The chair is Paul Axelrod, a professor emeritus and former dean of education at York University. He has written widely on the history and policy development of schooling and higher education. His publications include Values in Conflict, Universities, the Marketplace, and the Trials of Liberal Education, Making a Middle Class, Student Life in English Canada during the 30s, and Making Policy in Turbulent Times, Challenge and Prospects for Higher Education. Paul is the recipient of the Distinguished Contribution Award from the Canadian History of Education Association. Over to you, Paul.
Good evening and welcome. Our theme tonight, Does Liberal Education Matter in the 21st Century, is a rhetorical question. Maybe. We'll find out. We're beginning these sessions with reference to an historical moment that helps frame the discussion that follows. Tonight's moment is the founding of York University in 1959. In light of the imminent flood of post-war baby boomers seeking university spaces, York University received authorization from the Ontario government to open that year, first on the site of what became Glendon College, and then with enlarged facilities at the new Keel and Steel site in North York in 1965. You can see the early evolution of York in these three pictures. Picture of Glendon Hall. Then a picture of York in an empty field with its first president. And then a picture of York in not such an empty field, the Ross Building, built in 1968 or opened in 1968. York's founding president was Murray G. Ross, who held a doctorate in education from Columbia University in New York and served as the University of Toronto's academic vice president from 1957 to 1959. A sociologist with interests in community development and leadership, Ross later published several works on the emergence and character of higher education. By the late 1950s, Ross had grown impatient with what he felt was the conservatism and rigidness of the University of Toronto, and was irked by the growing culture of specialization generally in North American universities. He believed students were not ready to specialize in first year, and he was heavily influenced by the philosophy of general education that had been embraced at Harvard University and at Columbia, where he'd been a graduate student. When York opened, it was obliged to offer the University of Toronto undergraduate curriculum for its first 4 years, after which it would become fully independent and free to forge its own academic direction. To prepare for this change, Ross initiated a curriculum design exercise that ideally would reflect his general education vision. He wanted to ensure that graduating students, whatever their areas of concentration or specialization, had the breadth of knowledge that would contribute to the education of, quote, the whole man, and equip them to address the modern problems of the world. The original plan envisioned 2 years of general education before specialization, as well as an alternative 4-year general education program, which would include for a full year the study of, quote, an alien, by which was meant a non-European, non-North American culture. Students would be required to take a common course in each of the interdisciplinary divisions versus departments of humanities, social science, and natural science. Owing to major disagreements among the faculty about the content of these courses and to concerns that students with a general education degree would have difficulty being admitted to graduate school, the program that actually emerged took a different form, but one that preserved the principle of general education. Students would take a designated number of general education courses and would normally not specialize until second year. While this outcome proved conventional in most respects, York's interdisciplinary divisions and its emphasis on the value of a general liberal education earned it a degree of distinctiveness on the Canadian educational landscape. How, in retrospect, should we assess Murray Ross's vision? Was he correct in trying to resist early specialization? Was the pursuit of interdisciplinarity a viable goal? Critics said and would still say that mastering one discipline was hard enough, even for academics with PhDs. Could undergraduates be expected to draw deeply from more than one discipline in pursuing their degrees? But one current writer goes even further than Ross, saying that disciplines should be abolished and that undergraduate programs should be organized exclusively around themes and problems. Instead of specializing in geography, for example, students would study climate change and draw from knowledge in the sciences, humanities, and social sciences in their course selections, and many other examples are possible. If liberal education has a future, what form should it take? Our speakers tonight, who I'm now pleased to introduce, have some things to say about that and other questions. So let's meet them. Lorna Marsden holds a PhD from Princeton University and is a former president and vice chancellor of both Wilfrid Laurier University and York University. She also served in Canada's Senate and is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario, and a former president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. She's been awarded a number of honorary doctorates. Her numerous publications include Leading the Modern University, York University's Presidents on Continuity and Change, and Canadian Women and the Struggle for Equality. Ian Milligan is an associate professor of history at the University of Waterloo. His primary research focus is on how historians can use web archives, as well as the impact of digital sources on historical practice more generally. He's the author of 2 monographs, History in the Age of Abundance and Rebel Youth, and co-author of Exploring Big Historical Data. In 2016, he was awarded the Canadian Society for Digital Humanities Outstanding Early Career Award, and in 2019, he received the Arts Excellence in Research Award from the University of Waterloo. Qiang Zha is an associate professor at the Faculty of Education, York, where he served as director of the graduate program from 2017 to 2020. He holds a PhD from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, and an MA from the Institute of Education, University of London. He's the author and editor of numerous articles and anthologies. He's been involved in a project entitled Liberal Arts Innovation in China, which was initiated by Duke Kunshan University and the Luce Foundation. He's an advocate for re-envisioning and transforming liberal arts education for the 21st century. Paul W. Gooch is professor of philosophy and president emeritus of Victoria University at the University of Toronto. He previously served as vice provost of the University of Toronto, and he's held many academic administrative positions at U of T. He was Commonwealth Fellow at the St. John's College, Cambridge, and visiting fellow at Clare Hall, Cambridge. He's currently chair of the Ontario University's Council on Quality Assurance. Professor Gooch is the author of Partial Knowledge, Philosophical Studies in Paul, which I assume is not an autobiography, and of Reflections on Jesus and Socrates, and most recently, Course Correction, a map for the distracted university. I'm now happy to call upon Dr. Lorna Marsden, who will assert that, yes, liberal education matters, but it has changed. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for organizing, you and Jason, this very interesting series. I've learned a great deal from the panelists in the first 3 sessions, and I'm very glad to be here this evening. Liberal values underlying the broad program of education that were the basis of York's undergraduate curriculum, designed originally by Murray Ross and his colleagues, contributed to a stronger and more inclusive Ontario. And in shorthand, I refer to them as liberal, small L liberal values. These values and the years the curriculum were created and then, of course, recreated, led the distinctive character of the university. The general education program and the way it was taught was intended to enjoy and bring in all Ontario's social classes and increasingly multicultural society. As many alumni will attest, they were a rich foundation for their future careers. But as you ask, are they still relevant? Well, the issues have changed in Ontario, and their value to Ontario's government authorities appears to have plunged recently. We all want to live in peace and freedom, and liberal values underpin this. Canadians, on the whole, indicate they don't want an authoritarian system. We have only to look south of our border to realize that liberal values have to be widely understood and reinforced to avoid the painful, divided, and acrimonious situation being faced in the USA. The liberal values have to be learned and practiced, and in the curriculum, I would say, at all ages. It appears that these liberal values are not self-evident. At universities, because the majority of our students are young adults, I just dropped my page, my apologies. And there are young adults coming to grips with the adult world and themselves. There is a special responsibility and opportunity. Liberal values in Canada have expanded slowly over the years. Social justice issues, equality rights, for example, have been widened since York was founded. And we are challenged to understand and debate not only culture, ethnicity, and minority rights, but the more recently recognized and promoted issues of gender identity, ingenuity, race, and disability. We have a major responsibility to research, document, debate, consider these issues, and provide an atmosphere in the classrooms, in assigned readings, in informal settings, where students and faculty together can explore these issues. For generations, this opportunity has been, to a great extent, in the context of the humanities, the sciences, in the broad original program that was suggested at York. And in a variety of courses from which one can grasp the basic values and controversies inherent in literature, philosophy, history, the sciences, and so on. But how you learn them matters. At the heart of the university experience for faculty and students are the times when you meet a student or a professor face to face, perhaps in a seminar or in an office, and assess each other. What does this person think about the concepts in the course? What is the person's interest and ability to analyze the issue? Can they defend their point of view in a rational way? Is it emotional for them? Is it entirely new? Is it a challenge to their existing beliefs and practices? It's about the individual, not tethered down by family of origin or social class or gender, etc., but as a person moving into a new understanding through this relationship of learning about individual freedoms in a changing and complex society, a society which students, because of the program, will now better understand. Student and professor see each other as individuals, and both are changed through the interaction. Well, there are students and professors who don't want to change, but I think the vast majority do. This is very difficult on online courses, and that's a challenge for everyone today. This point in the student's life is crucial and very important in all educational settings, where minds are open to new knowledge and experience, new friendships, new concepts about themselves. And university at its best is a protected environment for experimenting, changing one's mind, studying subjects that are new without fear of serious consequences. And that takes time and direct contact. We all know what our faculty and our students are missing under current conditions. But on the other hand, there are those who don't think this is important. MacKillop's fine history of Ontario universities from 1791 to 1951 described the struggles in the establishment of universities between those seeking to found a university and government, the politics, the religion, which was key in those early years, the land grants, the money. It was a struggle over control of the structure and programs. Would it be government and the bureaucracy? Would it be faculty members and the collegium? The provincial government won great power. They had the sole authority to say which institutions can grant degrees and in which programs. And government's focus, of course, on the economy, on labor markets, on employers, on taxpayers. But the universities also have great power. The province does not have the right to determine the curriculum. The bicameral system of the Board of Governors dealing with financial affairs and the Senate with the curriculum and standards determined that separation of powers. While the majority of Ontario universities in the early years had religious affiliations with one or another Christian belief system, the universities always retained the authority to admit and graduate students regardless of their religious beliefs. That was a score for the universities. But university had more than the power to ensure a good broad education. From the beginning, universities have always conferred social authority on their graduates. Being a graduate was important to one's social standing. It still is, and not only in the labor market. In the 18th and 19th centuries in Upper Canada, universities prepared clergymen and priests, but there were other institutions to train doctors and lawyers and other highly skilled occupations. But gradually, over many decades, those occupational skills training programs nudged their way into universities, in part because it elevated the social importance of those occupations, now usually referred to as the professions. The degree was important for social authority. And this all happened over a long period of time. For example, Osgoode Hall Law School was a freestanding law school until it became part of York University, only really in 1968. As the economy and jobs changed, all sorts of occupations began to demand that their practitioners have university degrees to qualify. Engineers, nurses, teachers, librarians, business people, and so many more. This has led to a dramatic change, not only in the labor market, but in the expansion of who comes to university. University degrees take time and they're expensive. Not everyone can afford them, and the lifetime earnings of many occupations do not offset the costs of a university degree. As Minister of Education and Universities in Ontario during the years 1962 to 71, Bill Davis, who was concerned about new labor market demands in post-industrial society, brought in the system of community colleges in 1965. The Colleges of Applied Arts and Technology, CATs as they're referred to, intended to focus on job training. Their programs were shorter or part-time, so the costs were much lower. This made it possible for students to get a qualification in many skilled occupations without as much time as apprenticeships or expense as university degrees. And the colleges did it very well. Employers got a well-prepared labor force. However, in 2000-2002, the province of Ontario, under pressure from the community colleges of arts, applied arts and technology, decided to give the colleges the power to grant degrees in some courses. But colleges do not have the bicameral system of governance. Colleges don't have Senate, so it was not the faculty members determining what would be offered in any program. And college faculty don't have the same resources as university faculty. They teach many more hours a day and so on. So a college degree means something very different from a university degree. Not better or worse, and often complementary, but quite different. But the province decided, and had the power to decide, that the colleges could offer and confer degrees. Their focus was on the economy, getting people jobs, getting employers workers. Murray Ross always supported transfers from the colleges into the universities on the grounds that exclusivity was based on social class differences. And York was the first university to locate a college campus, Seneca College, on our campus, so students could take joint programs with two distinct qualifications. But now the fact is the province has muddled the waters for students and employers. They have focused heavily on job preparation, and the universities in reaction have felt they must focus even more on their part-time and occupational programs. So has the government won the day? Financing universities was and remains a big issue for universities and for governments. There are capital costs for land and buildings. The province and major benefactors, originally the churches establishing the institution, paid these costs. Then there are operating costs, salaries, heat, light, maintenance, student services, residents, etc. These costs are paid by two sources: annual grants from the province based on the number of students in their programs, and, as you all know, student tuition. These two sources account for well over 80% of operating budgets. In the past 3 decades, government regulation over universities has increased massively. Governments now require universities to have an array of services over the social behavior of employees and students: employment equity, health and safety, financial and environmental regulation. And all this requires staff and lawyers and auditors to do this work and file annual reports to governments, and without any additional funding. Government bureaucracy has been doing exactly what Max Weber predicted in the 19th century. It's more efficient than universities can or should be, and it has great power. Over history, the proportion of university funding for the government of Ontario has evolved in various ways, but it declined precipitously over the past decades, and the cost of tuition has risen. A study by Alex Usher of all Canadian university budgets from last October shows that between 2000 and 2019, tuition as a portion of operational budgets rose from 38 to 56%, while government grants fell from 51% to 33%. It's almost the same at York University. In short, as the heavy hand of government regulation descended, the cost to students rose and rose. And so now government says that education is so expensive for students that universities must also become job shops. The last funding announcement from the Ontario government on promoting excellence is performance-based funding. The December 1st, 2020 announcement reads in part, performance-based funding is intended to help ensure that students will be able to find employment after graduation and will put a greater emphasis on student outcomes. The 10 metrics of performance are graduate employment rates, experiential learning, the economic impact of an institution, and research funding. Funding will now privilege those programs that lead more directly to jobs, not just graduate and professional programs, but also undergraduate programs. So taking the broad curriculum, literature, history, philosophy, biology, etc., all the programs undergraduate students take to learn and mature before they become accountants or business people or whatever they do for their career. The courses in which they hone their ability to think and become good citizens will have to be part of jobs preparation. No liberal arts degrees unhinged from jobs training, says the government. And the announcement goes on. The new agreements will also encourage transparency and accountability by ensuring that the spending of public dollars results in positive economic outcomes for Ontario, said Ross Romano, Minister of Colleges and Universities. Not a word about good citizens. Now, of course, jobs and employment are very important, but we also want wise citizens, cohesive communities, good partners and parents, a strong, evolving society of justice and understanding. It is more than our economy that builds Ontario. In fact, you need a strong social order to build an economy, but this is not mentioned. So liberal values in the expansion and maintenance of knowledge, social justice, and individual development lies in the minds of those who have had the opportunity to develop them, not only in university, of course, but more than in jobs and social media. And without a wide background, who will have the time and preparation to bring them to the improvement and maintenance of sturdy, free democracy? Now it appears that liberal values are not important to the government at present, but they are to those who wish to be citizens of a free, stable, and democratic society. So, in my opinion, we must insist on creating the conditions where young adults can learn and expand their awareness of how to link their knowledge and values to social action. It's time for a policy correction. So in the post-pandemic era, we have to make up so much for our students, including their experience of learning with peers and faculty members, who need to be very smart, very conscious and creative, and dedicated to the pursuit and expansion of the broad liberal curriculum in our classrooms, on our campuses, on our computers, and in our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to call upon Ian Milligan, who will speak on liberal education in the digital age. Ian?
Wonderful, thanks, Paul. Let me just... Wonderful. Well, it's an honor to follow Dr. Marsden's remarks, and I'll just start by thanking Paul Axelrod and Jason Ellis for the invitation, to the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation for bringing us all together. And I was scrolling the participant list and saw some familiar faces, so I wish we had a chance to say hi in person. And I should have also put in my bio, I'm a York alumni, so all the good things in this you can take as evidence of a York education, and the bad things you can blame on Waterloo. So what I want to do today in the next 10 minutes is talk a little bit about liberal education in the digital age. And when we think about what liberal education should look like in the 21st century, I thought it was worth starting by just thinking about how knowledge itself and how knowledge generation looks a lot different to us and students in the digital age. So that'll be part one. which can then in turn inform what our students need to learn, part 2 of my presentation, and how our universities, I think, have to change, or the final part 3. So we'll start by just highlighting briefly how traditional disciplines are really being transformed very rapidly over the last 10, 15 years. And I'll focus on history because I'm a historian by training, and history is one of these disciplines that seems so traditional. And even if we look at what historians do and what happens in our classrooms and our graduate degrees, we can see that it's been dramatically transformed by digital technology. Some quick examples, we all Google search for sources and information. That dictates what we do. We retrieve digitized newspapers from the comfort of a home office. We take quick research trips rather than going for months in Paris or months in Ottawa. It's a week of taking photographs to examine from home. And overall, there's this plethora of information online. And some of this has been great. It's, I think, arguably given us an increasingly global outlook as a discipline. And here I just gesture to my colleague, Laura Putnam at the University of Pittsburgh, who's done quite a bit of work on this. And I look at my own program and I see that it's not uncommon to have our master's students never step foot in a physical archive at all in their degree. In fact, I'd probably say that's the majority of our MA students now, do everything online. It's not uncommon for a PhD student or even a faculty member to take, a number of days of research trips in a given year rather than weeks. And I think crucially, we're all having this global outlook. We're looking across oceans to digitized resources, and we can start doing that in our first year. Now, like everything, COVID hasn't started trends, but it's accelerated trends. And I think we're seeing that where we're going to have entire cohorts, especially master's students, entire research projects that are going to be completed from home. So to sum up my first part, in 2 decades, we've seen historians radically transform. We're a traditional discipline. We were based in, at least in part, on the lived experience of researching in a place. And suddenly, we as historians, we Google search for our sources. We spend our time in JSTOR and ProQuest for primary sources. And in the case of most students, uncritically stitch together what we find into a hellish mishmash of sources. And that's not their fault. Some of the professors are doing it too. And crucially, as my segue to the main point of my talk today, we're not training them to do any better with the information abundance they have suddenly found themselves in. In other words, the world around us is changing. It's terrifying, but done well, it means that historians and other humanistic disciplines, well, we are going to need to develop skills to do our disciplines better, and these skills will in part benefit our students and our society. So how can we meet this challenge? How do we equip our students to meet what's before them? And I think I'll mention history, but this I think would benefit all liberal arts education. And you'll see in my recommendations here, this is what I think we're losing when we silo ourselves in the university. And these things that are cutting across so many disciplines don't get focused on. So if I had to pick 3 key skills that I think all students should learn across the university, I think all historians, all scholars, historians and other scholars need an understanding of algorithmic bias and awareness. This has restructured everything that we do. Google runs our lives, and we need to have our students and our faculty and everybody beginning to think, why is this search result on page number 7 on the first page? And why is this search result on page 600 never to be seen by a human eye? For historians, why was the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star digitized, but not the Toronto Telegram? How does that change the stories we write? Why was material from this well-funded archive put on the internet and consulted on a daily basis? Why was this archive, perhaps from a marginalized community, never digitized and languishing now in the great undigitized world of obscurity? Why is this book on Google Books? Why is this one not? What information am I basing my decision on? Now, teaching these sorts of things, algorithmic bias and awareness, is difficult. But I think, honestly, as a first start, if our students and faculty colleagues went down this list and started answering these questions, it would be a good start to beginning to become a critical consumer of information. And I think once you become a critical consumer of information and platforms, sure, we've equipped our students to be better researchers, but we're also equipping our students to be better citizens, so that when they have to parse COVID data, electoral results, newspaper content, their Facebook, their Instagram, their Twitter feeds, they begin to think about how the algorithms are shaping the world around us. Similarly, I'm a historian, so I have to put context in every presentation I do. I think we need to teach that the mediation of digital information matters. That for historians, we treat our newspaper, whether we found it in a clipping file or in a search engine or a database, we cite it the same and we think about it the same in our classrooms. And I think we need to think about foregrounding how we develop our knowledge. And similarly with context, I think of an example I like to use when I'm thinking about the importance of context is to think of my own time during my PhD in an archival reading room at McMaster. And I found a document written by a student radical in 1962 who was enthusiastic about the prospect of the Canadians launching nuclear-tipped missiles, and what if the Soviets could turn them around and they could turn back and hit the soldiers who had launched that missile. And because I was in a reading room and I'd been reading lots of 1960s radicals content, I understood that as a formative moment of their development. It wasn't that remarkable when it was viewed in the context of hundreds of documents written by similar peers, coming to grips with ideas of social change and the world around them and nuclear weapons. But if that just popped up on a Twitter feed, or if that was just pulled out of a Google search, decontextualized from all of that, it would be received very, very differently. And so I think we also need to teach scholars these historical skills of understanding context and making sense of information, not the decontextualized digital snippet, but how it fits into the broader information ecosystem. And more generally, our students and our curriculum need to have a better sense of digital literacy. None of these forces are specific to history. Everybody needs to understand the context of information, how information is mediated, how it is created, and how it is delivered to you. And I think we fall into the dangerous trap of the digital native, where we assume that our students, our 20-something students today, have an innate level of technical capacity to weigh these things, but they don't. They've grown up in a platform economy, and none of this is natural knowledge. It's something that we need to consciously teach and explain. So in my last 2 minutes, what should we do? Well, I pick on silos. Silos always get blown up despite their important role in our food infrastructure. But I think we've fallen back into the trap of putting lots of silos up around the university. And so when I think of the university, I think of all the barriers that we put up. So if I wanted to teach my students these things, or if I believed it was really important for us to do this across the curriculum at the University of Waterloo, I'd run into the problem of our disciplinary silos. History is content-based. We love content. We overlook methodology, so it falls into the cracks. Something like algorithmic bias should be in every curriculum, but if it's in every curriculum, it ends up sometimes being in no curriculum. And I think as many of our universities are moving towards these new and emerging budget models, and I think that's great for transparency, I'm seeing it, and I'm sure if we were in a room, a few people would be nodding at me. We're seeing really the reification of departments and faculties as we are compelled to think of ourselves as business units. And that leads to curricular decisions because we don't want to lose bums and seats to other programs, but that doesn't mean they always get the right students get the education they should ideally be getting. So I'll close with a successful example. I ran a course at the University of Waterloo a few years ago, the Socio-Political Implications of Artificial Intelligence. And we were funded by the Jaroslawski Foundation. And I raise this because I don't think it's a course that would have happened just if the university was on its own merits. But we were forced out of our comfort zone. Academic freedom was maintained. And we set up a course where we said, let's bring students from all 6 faculties. Let's make it a pseudo-competitive application. Let's get them to work on collaborative projects. Let's do pass-fail grading to take the disciplinary struggle out of it. Let's bring in people from all these faculties. Let's have art exhibits alongside computer science exhibits. And it really made me realize if we were pushed to do it, we could bring a really remarkable educational experience to our students. So I'll conclude. Traditional disciplines are being transformed by digital technology. I think we need to rethink how we equip and train our students to meet this challenge through an understanding of these 3 factors. And I think we probably need some gentle rethinking of how we structure universities, liberal education, and maybe a return to general education in more universities that have abandoned that over the last few years. Thank you very much, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. And I just want to remind the audience, if you have questions, please submit them on the chat format. And we'll next hear from Dr. Qiang Zha, who will answer this question. How should liberal arts education evolve in the 21st century? An exploration of universities in China and beyond. Qiang, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Let me start from reflecting on why I got involved in studying liberal education. Then I can go on to talk a little bit about what am I doing now. I came to academic profession as a pretty quantitative person. I liked playing with numbers, but then I became interested in the liberal education, initially because of the setbacks observed in democracies all over the world. And this, in my view, this could be attributed to a trust gap between the general population and the social elites, and in turn to a fundamental deficiency in the function and the scope of liberal education, which is needed to teach the skills and values essential to the greater participation in democracy. Then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic came, which in turn renders liberal education even more important for reinforcing the resilience in our society than riding the progress from this global catastrophe. As Professor Axelrod just mentioned, specifically there was a job which brought me into this area. That was in 2017. The Duke Kunshan University, which is the offshore campus of Duke University in China, that commissioned me to look at the best practices of liberal education or liberal arts education in China. And you know, Duke University is a leading institution for liberal education. So they hired me to do that job. Then I kind of identify a paradox with that job, because I realized liberal education has been challenged worldwide. Specifically, there's a criticism of its elite nature. It doesn't accommodate the STEM, I mean the science and technology students, their needs, or address the transformational impact of technology on every aspect of social and economic life. And it lacks curriculum and pedagogical innovation, and is unable to capture the emerging emphasis on design rather than mastery of knowledge, and unable to facilitate experiential learning. It is further seen as having less relevance to the real life and failing to adapt to a demographic shift in the student population that calls for embracing the diversity and inclusion. So this is kind of the paradox. On the one hand, we do need liberal education, and people now having such a consensus. On the other hand, it is being challenged and criticized. Besides, there are also confusions over the definition and the connotation of a dozen closely related concepts. And some of them were mentioned just now, such as liberal education, liberal arts education, general education, humanist education, whole person education, holistic education, classic education, and so on and so forth. So from there, my approach is a kind of the social change driver perspective. I would suggest working towards a new or perhaps a transformed model of liberal education that is suitable for the 21st century, and to tackle on the challenges presented by the current global context. So I call this approach a social change driver perspective, which is actually inspired by the notions such as, let me quote Gary Miller, He said liberal education is essentially concerned with the present and the future rather than the past. Likewise, let me quote William Atkinson. He said, this is even earlier, much earlier. He said, liberal education should differ from one generation to another. And another quotation I want to share here is Isaac Condell, who is a great comparative education educator. That is my field. And he said, the changing times bring changing emphasis in liberal education. He said this in one of his works published in 1939. So driven by such a social change driver perspective and taking into account the meta social changes such as expansion, massification of higher education, a knowledge-based economy, and intensifying process of globalization, I envision to transform liberal education and make it more relevant, appealing, and affordable to students in a changing contexts. We are adopting a model that comprises three essential pillars. One is humanist education. The second is cognitive education. And the third is global education. Humanist education is a fundamental for fostering critical thinking and a strong sense of social consciousness and responsibility, which expresses the continuing tradition of liberal education. Cognitive education might be dated back to Plato's vigorous philosophical education, such as the reasoning with dialectical thoughts and through mathematical procedures, as is now supported with a state-of-the-art knowledge about human cognitive development and understanding of learning process or learning progress. And to educate students such abilities and skills, let me quote Andy Hargreaves. To educate students the metacognitive skills, the ability to access, select, evaluate knowledge, the ability to develop, apply various forms of intelligence, the ability to work and learn effectively, and in teams, an ability to create, transpose, and transfer knowledge, the ability to cope with ambiguous situations and problems, the ability to learn to redesign themselves and their careers, and the ability to choose and fashion relevant education and training. So cognitive education is necessary to educate students for the world full of the unscripted challenges. Global education is crucial for developing a global consciousness, ethical and empathetical thinking around the world. It ensures that we are knowledgeable about the fate of others, care for others across borders, and connect in all sorts of new ways and possible ways to support each other at both the local and global levels. More importantly, global education can help us to define and develop the concept and the skills of the global competence. So my argument is these three essential pillars should not be viewed as separate modules, but rather as interrelated basic courses. So put in a clear way, the individual institution in a particular country could build a portfolio of courses that span the three pillars, which in turn would be tailored to the institution's preference for the indigenous or institution-based flavor. More recently, I imagine liberal education could be coupled with the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, given the obvious parallels between them. A liberal education is a fundamental meant to stimulate and inspire students to determine what humans are meant to do and what human society is meant to be. In the meantime, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and a more sustainable future for all. We know there are altogether 17 interlinked SDGs. Number 1, no poverty. Number 2, zero hunger. Number 3, good health and well-being. Number 4, quality education. Number 5, gender equality. Number 6, clean water and sanitation. Number 7, affordable and clean energy. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. Number 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. Number 10, reducing inequality. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. And number 12, responsible consumption and production. Number 13, climate actions. Number 14, life below water. 15, life on land. And 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And finally, 17, partnerships for the goals. And they can roughly cluster into 3 domains, in my view. Number 1, respect life and civilization, and build a decent life for all. Number 2, rhyme sustainable social and economic development. And number 3, promote harmony between human being and nature, which might approximately correspond to the 3 essential pillars I propose for liberal education in the 21st century. In turn, the SDGs might support the liberal education in such ways. Epistemologically, it might foster the purposeful learning, promote and advance the values behind the learning in liberal education. At the curriculum level, the SDGs might boost open and multidisciplinary curriculum, in particular involving the STEM teachers and students, and also promote the curricular relevance. On the pedagogical level, the SDGs may encourage the theme-based approach to teaching and learning, teamwork, experiential learning in liberal education, which has been identified as deficiency in the liberal education teaching and learning. Right now, I'm working on a shared partnership grant proposal, as I mentioned earlier, which aims to set up a research network connecting the partners in North America, East Asia, and Western Europe, where the liberal education is conceptualized under different traditions and tackled with distinctive strategies. So far, I have such confirmed partners, including York University and OISE, Maple League. Some of you must be familiar with the Maple League. They are full medium-sized or small-size and Atlantic Canadian universities: Acadia, Bishop, Mount Allison, St. Francis Xavier, and also the Duke University and Beloit College in the US, University College Freiburg in Germany, International Christian University and Hiroshima University in Japan, Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and Peking University and Tsinghua University in China. And of course, York University is the host institution, which is very suitable, as the previous speakers already mentioned, especially Professor Axelrod mentioned in the introduction. So our research objectives and questions include, just read quickly a list of the research questions. So that will be our research agenda for this partnership. What new possibilities are emerging for liberal education in a contemporary context and in a new normal in the post-pandemic era? What innovations and amendments might enrich liberal education in contemporary universities, and particularly in a post-pandemic era? What new evidence is needed to examine learning outcomes and ensure attainment of liberal education goals? What liberal education can liberal education help prepare students for a fulfilling life career in knowledge societies, not simply a career for life in a knowledge-based economy? Could liberal education be extended to cater to the needs of the majority of students amid massification of higher education and the drive of the educational democratization? How could liberal education address issues of social justice and equity in the face of the meritocracy trap or myth, and fix the broken ladder for the social mobility? How could liberal education empower STEM students and vocational students? Could liberal education contribute to rethinking the process of globalization towards an ethical and sustainable model, and connecting people across the world in new ways to support a globalization from below? Could liberal education be adjusted to different cultural and knowledge traditions and provide a platform for in-depth intercultural communications? These research objectives can cluster into 5 domains. Number 1, liberal education model within different culture and knowledge traditions. 2, liberal education for social justice and equity amid the drive of educational democratization. 3, liberal education curriculum and pedagogy in the context of mass higher education. 4, emerging agenda and stakeholders of liberal education in a new normal of post-pandemic era. And 5, finally, attainment and impact of liberal education. So these 5 domains will enable the cross-fertilization of ideas for reimagining liberal education. So our collaborators from all the partner institutions may choose to join one or more research clusters based on their expertise and interest, and cross-examine issues concerning liberal education with the broader parameters and thinking about the liberal education for the 21st century. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll move to our final speaker, Dr. Paul Gooch, who contends that proper education is liberal education. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Paul, and Enoch Turner's Schoolhouse for this series and for this opportunity, and to thank my fellow panelists. Some very, very good ideas about curriculum in liberal education. I'm not going to talk about curriculum unless we want to do that in the chat. I'm a philosopher, and so I like to think simple thoughts and thoughts that I think should guide our approach to this whole topic. So I'm going to share my screen here as long as I can get the right one. There it is. And as Paul said, this is my claim that proper education is liberal education. The first proposition is a very simple one. I think that Lorna Marsden made the point that liberal education matters less and less, it seems. So I would just repeat her points, but here are a couple of stats, if you'd like. In the 4 years, 2014 to 2018, in all Canadian post-secondary institutions, that is colleges and universities, enrollments in STEM subjects have gone up 16.4%, and enrollments in arts and humanities have gone down 10.6%. If you look at Ontario, over a longer period of time, over 10 years, here are the humanities enrollments down here. They've gone down by 25%. And engineering sciences have gone up by 60% on these professional programs as well. So humanities do not matter, it seems. And the arts, liberal education. Now we have to be a little cautious in interpreting this data, and Ian was right to talk about context when we think of this kind of information. There has been a significant international enrollment in Canada, mainly from China and from India, and those students all want to do commerce and computer science, engineering, and life science. So that may account for some of this movement. But I think, Lorna, you were right that there's a strong emphasis in society and in government on employment and the economy. And the jobs are in a knowledge economy, So I think students are expressing those concerns and those interests and voting with their feet. So all of this is true, but now I want to make another very simple claim that liberal arts programs do not equal a liberal education. So we see this decline, but that's not really what a liberal education is about. And I want to make a distinction between means and ends. So I don't think that the goal of a liberal education is to complete a particular program in the liberal arts, to get a certificate or a diploma in history, even although that would be a good thing, or in philosophy or English. I don't even think that the goal of liberal education is to master content, to demonstrate know-how. I think that's more like training rather than liberal education. I think the goal is to be educated liberally. That is, to become a certain kind of person, what we call an educated person. We use the word liberal because it's about liberating, about freedom. And it's about freedom, not just in the political or civic sense. It's, as Plato well understood, freedom from the narrowness and constraints of who we are, how we're built, how we are brought up, our families, our societies, and the assumptions that we make about the world. The constraints of prejudice or ignorance, not being able to see things that we should be seeing. That's the goal of liberal education. It's to become an educated person. So I say it's not content, but it's character. And I don't mean character in being a nice moral person. I mean having intellectual and moral strengths that define what it is to be a really great, flourishing human being. That is curiosity about the world, about having the courage to investigate, to acknowledge when you don't know something, to persevere, get up again when you make mistakes, to have what philosophers these days are increasingly interested in, and that's a kind of intellectual humility, rather than being the know-it-all or thinking that your way is the only right way. A respect for truth. And I think this is a huge deficit today. And Ian, you spoke about teaching our students to figure out the meaning of information and its limits, and why, when we search, Google gives us this kind of answer. So to question and to respect truth and to respect language, instead of thinking that language doesn't matter, to, if I may be a little irreverent, to have a good nose for bullshit. I mean, this is what we need in an educated person. So this is my view of liberal education. Not content, but intellectual and moral character. So if there's liberal education, there's also an inadequately liberal education. That would be when you can perform all kinds of tasks and sniff out knowledge and so on, but you wouldn't be able to have the courage to keep going if you ran into troubles. You would have an inadequate liberal education if you didn't understand the moral consequences, the ethical consequences of certain decisions. And then there's an illiberal education, because let's face it, we're all educated in some way. So we can be educated liberally, inadequately, or illiberally, And I think we've all seen the results of that. My third claim is simply that we need a properly liberal education more than ever, because science and technology, although they're hugely important, they cannot alone solve the problems of our world. And they themselves create problems. So look, here are 4 big problems we're facing: the pandemic, the climate crisis, the misuse of IT and AI and social media, fake news, the rise of illiberal democracy. These are all huge problems. But what science does is to create tools, and technology uses those tools, but they're not going to solve these problems for us by themselves. With the pandemic, we have huge issues of public trust. We're struggling with ethical issues about who gets vaccinated. We're struggling with issues of vaccine hesitancy. These are not scientific issues. They're not technological issues. They're deeply human issues. Likewise with the climate crisis. Technology creates the crisis. We can use it to solve the crisis, but that's all about ethics, about sustainability. These are deeply human questions. They are not science and technology questions. So illiberal education ends up in illiberal democracy, and it produces our science and technology and commerce will produce tools for betterment, but without a proper liberal education, the tools won't be used right, or they'll be used to dangerous ends and purposes. So let me conclude by saying that it isn't enough for philosophers and historians and literary people and myself to lament the declining enrollments in humanities and the arts. We've got to deliberate widely about what it takes to be a properly educated person. That's a discussion that has to go wide and deep at all levels. And I'll end, since I'm a philosopher, with some words by Marie Sinclair. In order for any society to function properly and to its full capacity, it's got to raise and educate its children so that they can answer what philosophers such as Socrates and Plato and our elders called the great questions of life. That's what proper education is. That is liberal education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your excellent, stimulating, thought-provoking presentations. We have some questions. I'm going to begin, though, asking whether the panelists themselves would like to respond to what they've heard from other panelists. Are there any observations or questions that you have for each other? Anybody want to take the first shot at it? No? Okay, well, let's, I'm sure you'll be provoked. I have a question here, and it picks up a bit from what Professor Gooch was just talking about, the rise of intolerance and what you referred to as illiberal behavior, if not education. What responsibility do universities have for the rise, if any, of dogmatism, illiberalism, intolerance that we've seen? And how should universities, how could and should universities respond to what we've been witnessing in the last couple of years? Anybody want to respond to that?
Well, Paul, I would say that it's not just the last few years, that this has been going on for a very long time. And one of the main points of the kind of education I think we've all been talking about was equipping our graduates with skills to make their case, but listen to the other case and concede and develop an alternative to the immediately opposed conditions. We all know that what happens on our campuses, especially in the undergraduate years, involves a lot of conflict between people about views about very important issues and a lot of trivial issues. And that's the great opportunity we have to bring people together. And I think most universities do try to do that by setting up certain kinds of student circumstances in which the issues are debated out and resolved, not always resolved, but it's an advantage of an undergraduate education that quite clearly a lot of people have not had. I'm not saying it can't be learned elsewhere, but we have a responsibility and an opportunity to really work on this issue.
Other comments from the other panelists on this question?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Paul. And just to come back to our current situation, I think it's very important to do that, as Lorna said initially, face-to-face. I think that it's very easy to construct your enemy or your opponent, to be able to, with one click of your mouse, shut them up. I think being in the same room and learning that kind of respectful conversation, passionate conversation, but respectful, I think that is hugely important, and I hope that we do not lose that.
Okay. Question? Oh, sorry, who?
Oh, Ian.
Is that Ian?
I think that's a great question. And it just made me think, I was seeing a colleague talking about course evaluations today. And, the fear that he had teaching it was a diversity in Canadian politics class. He was tweeting about it. And it became a mandatory course, and his course evaluations tanked because many students didn't want to be exposed to those arguments. It was made voluntary and they went back up again. And it made me think that I worry in the absence of having, interdisciplinary classes and general education classes, that we're seeing students also, even when we're in person, are clustering themselves within the university. A certain kind of student takes courses in gender and social justice. A certain kind of student might take courses, in certain economic parts of our faculty, et cetera. And I worry that by specializing students so early, we're also not seeing that exchange of very diverse perspectives that we might have seen with a more robust general education curriculum.
Okay, thank you. Lorna?
Ian, would you extend that back to what I thought was a very interesting ideas that you put forward this evening? But the thing that worries me about what you can now do is that it means that people don't go and live in other cultures. If you were a science student, you might go and work at a university or live in other societies, not only for your research, but for all the other things that come with it. Learning other languages, learning how other people live, learning about other histories. That's always seemed to me to be so important. We have less of it. And so would you add that into what needs to happen for?
Yeah, and I completely agree. Both the internationalization, when you think about it as students, but I mean for researchers and historians, and I think we see that where granting councils are now frowning if you say you want to go live in Paris for 2 months to do research. But there is that intangible thing, and you begin to see, could you be a French historian without having been to France for more than a weekend? Could you be a historian of the Winnipeg General Strike when you've been to Winnipeg, to take photos in the archives for 2 days or something like that? And it's forcing us to ask these questions and hopefully step back from an instrumental, metrics-driven, we need to be as productive as possible. Productivity is important. I don't think we want to sidestep that. But what are we losing along the ways when we're so narrowly focused on grinding through documents in a weekend?
Can I quickly jump in to add an observation? So Paul, you mentioned that scenario. If it is an issue for the Canadian students, it's more an issue for international students. So I'm just speaking kind of from the perspective of international students. And we have more and more international students on the Canadian university campuses. And often, of course, Chinese is the the largest group, often they are accused not adapting to or embrace the Western values. So they contribute money to the university operating budget, but they don't really integrate themselves into the Western values. So this is my observation, could be added to your question. So I'm just curious how and what measures can be taken and to to integrate international students into liberal education.
Okay. There is a question, Qiang, while you are on this topic. Your research is involving the study of liberal education in China. Is it possible to have genuinely liberal education in China when certain subjects just aren't allowed to be discussed in the humanities and social sciences? How are you grappling with that issue in your own research?
There are two things I may say about that. One is rather negative. If you go to China now, you will see universities paying a lot of attention, investing a lot of resources for liberal arts education. They use the specific term, liberal arts education. But this is not really for the sake of the liberal arts education. It's mostly for profiling the universities, because the liberal arts education is very much linked to the elite education. So this is the way they profile the university status. So I see this as a negative. On the other hand, somehow optimistic, I can see a lot of interesting interactions in the classroom. Even though those curriculum are kind of boring and mostly borrowed from the Western systems, but quite a lot of the interesting interactions happening in the classroom between the teachers and the students. I would say today, the Chinese university teachers, they have a lot of flexibility in the classroom, and they can really make good use of such a flexibility and freedom in the classroom. And finally, I want to add a point. The liberal arts education in China is mostly about character education. So you have to understand in a different way. Other people must be very surprised. How could possible, Chinese universities exercising or implementing liberal education about critical thinking? It's not really about critical thinking. It's about character development. So they take liberal arts education in kind of different ways, or interpret in a different ways.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here. How do we convince the provincial government to give more support for the liberal arts? And this was alluded to earlier. Is there, perhaps Lorna, you've had lots of experience working with government. What's the secret?
Well, government always faces a lot of different problems. And at the moment, I think they're very, very concerned about the economic situation of the province, and that's understandable. But at the same time, members of the government, any government, and this is not a partisan issue, are concerned about the extent to which people understand language, can get along in the community, and so on. At the moment, they don't see those values attached to the labor market. I think they're very strongly attached to the labor market. And the field of labor relations and economic sociology, all those people deal with workplace issues, human resources, and many other parts are based on, in fact, the kind of values that we've all been talking about and the kind of interaction that we've all been talking about. It extends to law and in many other ways. We need to put the case clearly. They're not saying, as I understand it, and remember, I'm not in charge of anything in the university anymore, but as I understand the new policy, they're saying, well, it has to lead to a job. Well, if you think of all the jobs that require good communication skills, good human understanding, good ability to bring people together to resolve disputes, it's a very wide range of jobs. And in that sense, I think if we put the case properly, there is support for liberal education.
Any other panelists want to comment on that? Okay.
I can just chime in.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
I kind of joke, and it'd be almost like Lorna and Paul should be leading the public relations press, because I think, and part of this is I'm sitting on our board at Waterloo right now, and I'm surprised how open everybody is to liberal education, how open everybody is to the arts and humanities. And I look at us in history, I look at my colleagues in other arts disciplines, and I often think we don't articulate it that well. We fall back on writing skills. We fall back on these things where we're not really going to compete. You don't really get a history degree to learn how to write well. I think you get a history degree for all the reasons we've talked about on this panel today. So part of it, I think, is the blame of us trying to figure out how we're going to articulate what we bring to the table, and not feel like it's the provincial government out to get us.
Mm-hmm. This issue of the universities preparing people for the labor market, it's presented and historically has been as if it's an educational problem, but it's really an economic issue. And so in good economic times, everybody finds jobs, and the demand is high. In challenging economic times, lots of people are challenged, whether it's in computer science, engineering, or the teaching of English, or the degree in English. And so I think, we students understand these things. They vote with their feet, as someone said before. It's hard to imagine universities turning themselves inside out to try and respond to a particular labor market moment. That's not what they do. Anyway, editorial comment. Though, Ian, there is a question here about doing the kind of research that you do with digital sources. Is it possible, and you've mastered so much of this work, but is it possible, and ironically, in an age when we have more information than ever, that 50, 75 years from now, it'll be harder than ever to actually write history because so many of those sources will have disappeared? I mean, just an example in research that I've done, government websites are around and then they're gone, and that's where you're looking for historical research. Is it going to be harder or easier to do the work, and not only in history but in related fields in the future?
Yeah, well, I can plug my book here, which tackles this question head on. I think it's a mixture of things. I think sometimes, and I'm writing a new book on this, hopefully, we fall into the trap of the digital dark age, where we think of the golden age of print-based resources, where we have this durable record, and suddenly everything's going to change, and our photos are going to go off into the ether, and websites we're going to lose, et cetera. And there's truth to that, because I think we can see how fragile digital sources are. We're about to live through a presidential transition in the US, and we'll see that firsthand, how the federal government will change its web presence overnight. But ultimately, libraries and archives are on this, that they're preserving material. They're preserving material on an aggregate scale that has been unimaginable before. They have plans. They're resourced not as well as they should be, but they are preserving this information. And to me, the challenge, bringing it back to what we've been talking about, the challenge is skill sets. That suddenly, I think, to make sense of information, whether it's doing a freedom of information request today or historical research in 20 years, suddenly requires you to sift through a ton of information in a way that, until recently, that's been a computer scientist's job or an information retrieval specialist. And we're dumping, buckets of information on historians or journalists who don't always learn the skills they need to deal with that. So I do think it's a very big challenge, but I think it's less a challenge of preserving information and more a challenge of making sure that people are equipped to be, digital citizens and deal with all of this information.
Right, thank you. Okay, I have a question here. Could panelists comment on how increasing and highly monetized values contribute to and are driving amoral, unethical, and illiberal societies? The pandemic has surfaced the lack of a living wage, homelessness, and a healthcare system that are no longer universal. How perhaps could reframing the importance of the principles of a liberal education invite a rethinking of what really matters? Is the pandemic an opportunity? Now, it strikes me that Qiang, you were touching on some of those things. Do you want to comment on that question?
I can say a few words from the angle of the globalization. On the one hand, we have this kind of, maybe we can call the crisis of globalization, anti-globalization. Is definitely at a crossroads. Partially, I believe it is because the neoliberalism, which is driving globalization from behind. And so this is not a flat word or the playground, as Thomas Friedman say, this is a flat. This is not flat. Obviously, some people benefit a lot more, many others lose in this playground. And I would say the pandemic might be providing us a chance to reflect on that. Prepare us to consider more about others in the different countries. So this is an opportunity for us to reflect deeply about the pathway and trajectory of globalization, and thinking how to steer this process towards a more ethical and sustainable path.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and go back to a question I raised earlier and ask, and I may direct it to Paul Gooch, but others certainly can comment on that. Murray Ross had the vision of general education and interdisciplinarity driving liberal education and/or the liberal arts. Was he right? And how have we been doing on that? Is the critique true that it's too hard to learn just one discipline? So how can we expect people to draw from more than one discipline? How are we doing on that, Paul? How would you evaluate how the institutions have handled that? Because most places claim to be interdisciplinary. Has that helped the quality of undergraduate education or watered it down?
Well, I think it's even increasingly hard to master one discipline these days. I mean, the amount of information that's available, it's huge. So I think we've given up on trying to master a discipline, particularly at the undergraduate level. What we want to do is have our students learn how to navigate the discipline, what the fundamental questions are, how to find answers. And I think universities have been doing a very interesting job in creating programs that are area studies programs or thematic programs. At the University of Toronto, about half of the undergraduate programs are not in a discipline. They're in an area, a theme, cities, urban studies, equity and gender studies, Caribbean studies. And I think this is a very, very good way to bring the expertise of various disciplines together so that the student isn't mastering them all, but rather understanding how a particular problem can be illuminated from a variety of perspectives. So I don't like specialization too early. I think U of T has got it right. You can't choose your major or your specialist until your second year. The program we began at Vic 1, isn't about the disciplines at all. It's putting smart people together in a room and letting them work on something. So I think the universities are doing not a bad job, but the emphasis is now at the master's level for the professional master's degree. That's where a lot of the attention has come in the province of Ontario. More master's degrees have been created than undergraduate programs in the last few years. So I don't know if that That helps, Paul.
Well, I think ending on that uplifting, positive note is exactly the right thing to do. And I want to thank the panelists for their very provocative and interesting presentations, and the audience for the questions that have been submitted, and for your presence. I'm going to turn the podium back to Lynn Carrillo, who will bring the session and the series to an end.
Thank you, Paul. On behalf of the board of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation, I would like to offer our very sincere thanks to Paul and Jason for coordinating this outstanding series, to Mariah Bell and Jared Ross for amazing technical support, and to Jared and Len Knott for media relations. To all our panelists, to our generous supporters, and to you, our guests, we are delighted and honored to have had this opportunity to meet you and to learn together. And I think Enoch Turner would be proud of us. We invite you to stay tuned to our website because we fully intend to carry on with future events. So thank you and good evening.
Thank you.